Hi everyone, my name is Tom Pettit and welcome to this week's episode of Beyond Come Follow Me. Over the course of several years, the church they acquired the historic sites in Kirtland, Ohio. They renovated the facilities and the homes, and then came the time for dedication. President Gordon B. Hinckley flew out from Salt Lake to Kirtland and he dedicated these historic sites. Part of that dedicatory prayer included this phrase from the prophet. Speaking of Kirtland, of course, in no other area of the church was so much revelation received. In no other place was thy beloved Son so revealed to mortal man. In no other place was there such remarkable manifestations given to so many. Now, this week in your Come Follow Me lessons, you will be studying the revelations known as sections 41, 42, 43, and 44. And for a few minutes today, I'm going to share with you the historical context, some of the church history stories that led to Joseph receiving these very important revelations, the first four of many that he would receive here in the Kirtland area. Kirtland is a special place in the history of the church. So much happened here. I just quoted President Hinckley referring to the divine manifestations that occurred here in Kirtland. In no other place of the church, he said, was so much divine manifestation received, and in no other place was thy divine Son revealed than here in Kirtland. Now, of those stories, I shared a lot with those in a video a couple of weeks ago, which I entitled the Easter Beyond Come Follow Me lesson. And so you can check that out if you haven't. Some of the other things that took place here in Kirtland, and we're going to get to sections 41 through 44 in just a moment, but I want to impress on your mind some of the significant things that would take place during the Kirtland era while the church was headquartered here. A lot of firsts took place. This was the location, Kirtland, Ohio, where the first headquarters of the church officially were. The first presidency was formed, the first quorum of the 12 apostles was organized, the first quorum of the 70, the first patriarch was called here, the first bishop was called, first high priests were ordained here, the first stake was formed, the first high council was organized, the first bishop's storehouse was here in Kirtland, as well as the first missionary training center, and of course the first temple and temple ordinances. Other significant revelations would be revealed here, such as the law of the church, which we're going to talk about today, the oath and covenant of the priesthood, the word of wisdom, the 3 degrees of glory, the law of consecration, which we're going to talk a little bit about today, welfare principles, which we'll talk about, the revelation known as the olive leaf, the Civil War prophecy, many other prophecies were given here in Kirtland, a couple of which I'm going to mention today, as well as, of course, the first temple and temple ordinances in this dispensation, were the temple constructed and the first ordinances performed here in Kirtland. So Kirtland is an exciting place. It's going to take us several weeks to get through all the revelations that were received here in Kirtland. 64 revelations that are contained in the Doctrine and Covenants were received here in Kirtland. So we're leaving behind New York, Fayette, Palmyra, Manchester. We're leaving behind Harmony, Pennsylvania, and the infant church is now moving to Kirtland, Ohio, where it will be headquartered for the next several years. Kirtland had been prepared. Joseph wasn't walking into the wilderness and starting from scratch, leaving behind the growth that had taken place in New York. He was coming into an area of the church which was established and growing rapidly, and now we were gathering everybody together for a short time until we moved some saints off to Missouri. But here we were getting everybody together, and the Lord had prepared, had set it up. Behold, a marvelous work is about to come forth. It's coming forth in a lot of different places, but the central part or focus is now Kirtland. This is where the organization of the church is going to become more formal. This is where the Lord is going to give more revelation. And of course, the temple is going to be built. But how did the Lord prepare it? If you go back and look at section 35, and I spent some time on this a week or two ago. In section 35, the Lord is speaking to Sidney Rigdon. And the Lord tells Sidney, I've been preparing this area. I prepared you specifically. And you and the rest of everybody who's now joined the church, you guys didn't know it at the time. Of course, I'm paraphrasing here. But the Lord says, you didn't know it at the time, but I was preparing you and everybody else for this gathering here in Kirtland. So let me give you just a couple of names that had been prepared that were here in the Kirtland area ready to receive the gospel when those first 4 missionaries brought the message of the restored gospel to the area. The Snow family, they lived about 30 miles south of Kirtland. Now, who are the Snows? Well, Mr. and Mrs. Snow aren't too well known, but their one daughter and their one son are real well known. Eliza R. Snow and Lorenzo Snow. They lived just a few houses to the west of the Johnsons, who had boys about the same age as Lorenzo, so they were friends. Those boys, Lyman and Luke, would become apostles, future members of the first quorum of the 12 apostles. Isaac Morley would be incredibly influential on the growing church, not only as a spiritual leader, but as a temporal provider as well. Joseph and Emma would live on his property for a time. A couple of general conferences of the church would be held there. As converts were moving in, they were camping on his property. And some marvelous things took place there that I have shared with you in the past, but I'm going to share with you in the future, and also a few stories about Isaac Morley today. Parley P. Pratt, he was living in the east. He decided to go out west, wasn't quite sure why. He went out there, he met Sidney Rigdon. They were full of zeal in religious pursuits, and they had a friendship, so it made it really easy that when Parley P. Pratt went east, discovered the truth of the restoration, was baptized, he came back, and he was able to share that message of the restoration with his friend Sidney, who then in turn allowed Parley and his missionary companions to share the restored gospel message with Sidney's congregation, who were desperately looking for truth, knowing that no church had complete truth, and they were waiting and searching for it. Edward Partridge, the first bishop of the church, who we're going to talk about a little bit more today as we did last week, he was there ready and seeking truth and accepted it. So did Philo Dibble and Lyman White, Levi Hancock. These are names that you've heard. Everybody that was here in Kirtland when the missionaries arrived, they accepted the gospel, and now Joseph is coming to organize them and to use these individuals and many others as a foundational jumpstart to really get the work going. These would be the future leaders of the church. These would be some of the first missionaries. Well, the Lord was preparing all of these people. He called those 4 missionaries that I've told that story before. They come out, they start baptizing all these people who were ready to accept the gospel because they were seeking truth, and they recognized it when they saw it. And within 3 weeks of those missionaries' first arrival into the Kirtland area, 127 people had joined the church through baptism. One of those individuals, and I mentioned his name, or if I didn't, let me mention it now, was John Murdoch. John Murdoch was one of those initial baptisms, one of those initial converts. And he was baptized by Parley P. Pratt, and I've got his testimony here that I want to share with you to give you an idea, feeling of what was happening in this Kirtland area at the time that Joseph arrived on the scene, which we're going to deal with sections 41 through 44. But here's what John Murdoch says. This is in November 1830. Joseph doesn't even arrive until February 1831, so a few months before the prophet arrives. John Murdoch says, "I was soon introduced to those 4 men from New York and presented with the Book of Mormon. I stayed alone and read the Book of Mormon. I read till it was late. The Spirit of the Lord rested upon me, witnessing to me of the truth of the work. I told the servants of the Lord that I was ready to walk with them into the waters of baptism. Accordingly, Elder Parley P. Pratt baptized me in the Chagrin River, and the Spirit of the Lord sensibly attended the ministration, and I came out of the water rejoicing and singing praises to God and the Lamb. An impression sensibly rested on my mind that cannot by me be forgotten. This was the 3rd time I had been immersed," meaning he had been baptized in other churches 2 previous times. "But," he continues, "I never before felt the authority of the ordinance, but I felt it this time, and felt as though my sins were forgiven. On Sunday evening, they confirmed about 30. I was one of the number. Elder Oliver Cowdery was an administrator. I was also ordained an elder, and it was truly a time of the outpouring of the Spirit. I know the Spirit rested on me as it never did before, and others said they saw the Lord and had visions." A testimony to the quote of President Hinckley that I started with. In no other area of the church was so much revelation received. In no other place was thy beloved Son so revealed to mortal man. In no other place was there such remarkable manifestations given to so many. Now, just to backtrack for half a minute, to catch us up if you missed last week. Section 38, the Lord gives to Joseph the commandment. In section 38, verse 32. Wherefore, for this cause I give unto you a commandment, that ye should go to the Ohio, and there I will give unto you my law, and there you shall be endowed with power from on high. If you flip the page to section 39, the blessings of assembling in Ohio. And inasmuch as my people shall assemble themselves at the Ohio, I have kept in store a blessing, such as not known among the children of men. And it shall be poured forth upon their heads, and from thence men shall go forth into all nations. John Murdoch's testimony proves that the Lord was right, that there was a blessing. In fact, ironically, and not even ironically, but John Murdoch used some of those same words and phrases in November of 1830 to signal what he was feeling. It was those same words and phrases that the Lord had used as well, those wonderful blessings, the outpouring of the Spirit and whatnot. Well, those two sections, 38 and 39, were given to Joseph. The first in December, the other in January. And about this same time, there was something happening in Kirtland. It was happening to Newell K. and Elizabeth Ann Whitney. Their store is pictured here behind me. Now, if you were to go to the store to the north, just across the street to the north is their home. So they lived not here, they lived in their home, and then across the street is this store, which is pictured behind me. It was at their home that while section 38 and 39 were being received by Joseph, Newell K. and Elizabeth had heard the missionaries, they were feeling the Spirit, they were wanting to know more and be a part of this. They hadn't been baptized yet, and they were saying their prayers one night together. And Elizabeth Ann says this about that night while they were praying. One night, it was about midnight, as my husband and I in our house at Kirtland were praying to the Father to be shown the way, the Spirit rested upon us and a cloud overshadowed the house. It was as though we were out of doors. The house passed away from our vision. We were not conscious of anything but the presence of the Spirit and the cloud which was over us. We were wrapped in the cloud. A solemn awe pervaded us. We saw the cloud and felt the Spirit of the Lord. Then we heard a voice out of the cloud saying, "Prepare to receive the word of the Lord, for it is coming." Then she continues, "At first we marveled greatly, but from that moment we knew that the word of the Lord was coming to Kirtland." And indeed it was. This was sometime late December, early January. On February 1st, 1831, Joseph and Emma, in a horse-drawn sleigh, pulled up to the Whitney store that is pictured behind me. This was their first stop after arriving in Kirtland. It's a store. Newell K. Whitney is tending his store. He's standing as clerk behind the desk, or behind the counter. And Joseph walks through this door, and he extends his hand across the counter and takes Newell K. Whitney by the hand. And he says, "Newell K. Whitney, thou art the man." And Newell says, "I cannot call you by name as you have me." Joseph replies, "I am Joseph Smith, the prophet. You have prayed me here. Now what would you have of me?" And that was Joseph's introduction. "The word of the Lord is coming," the voice said to Newell and Elizabeth. And Joseph arrived a month or so later. Now Newell's grandson, Orson F. Whitney. Did I say his grandson? Newell's grandson is Orson F. Whitney. He would later write as testimony of this very experience. Quote, "By what power did this remarkable man, Joseph Smith, recognize one whom he had never before seen in the flesh? It was because Joseph Smith was a seer, a choice seer. He had actually seen Newell K. Whitney upon his knees, hundreds of miles away, praying for his coming to Kirtland. Now, there's a couple of lessons here to be learned. I know this is outside of sections 41 through 44, but I'm trying to set the stage of what's coming, what's going to be happening here in Kirtland. Now, a couple of lessons that we can learn here. Joseph is first commanded in section 37 to go to the Ohio, and that's that was first, and then again in section 38, as I just read. And in those two sections, they were received in December 1830. And we don't know what day in December, and it's probably irrelevant. But I would like to make an interesting point here. It's just kind of fun to think about. He receives those in December 1830. He arrives here at the Whitney store, has that interaction with Newell on February 1st, 1831. Now, you go from December to February 1st. How many days is that? Well, it depends on when that revelation in December took place. If it took place on December 1st, you're talking about 63 days from when the revelation was first given, or the first commandment was given to go to Ohio, until Joseph actually shows up in Ohio. If it was given on December 31st, well, then it's only 33 days. So somewhere between 33 and 66 days, Joseph has the commandment to go to Ohio, and he shows up in Ohio. That's incredible. That's remarkable. Think of it. Joseph has his family, brothers and sisters and mom and dad in New York. He's making himself temporally comfortable in that he's settling down and settling into a place on the Whitmer farm. Things are going okay. He has a place to do his work. He's translating the Bible. The church is growing slowly, but it's growing. It's been established there. And all of a sudden the Lord says, you need to get to Ohio. And somewhere between 33 and 63 days, he's gone from New York. And he shows up right here in Ohio. He leaves all that behind. He just drops it and almost walks out the door. It's just that fast. The Lord spoke, and Joseph immediately obeyed. Years later in Nauvoo, Joseph made a comment, and he says, I have learned when the Lord commands, I obey. And not only does he obey, but here in this example, I've just shown you that he obeys quickly. And he did so. We learn and we teach about faith. Faith is not just a belief. Faith is action. And Joseph put into action his faith in the Lord. Lord, you want me to go to Ohio? Okay, I'm out of here. I'm gone. And he does. He packs up and he moves and he's out of. He's never been to Kirtland. Besides Sidney and Edward Partridge, he does in Parley. Well, Parley's in Missouri, so really just Sidney Rigdon and Edward Partridge. He doesn't know anybody in Kirtland. He's never been there. He doesn't have land or a home to go to or a job. But that was faith. The Lord said, go, and he says, okay, Lord, I know you'll take care of me. And so he got in the horse-drawn sleigh with his wife, and they went. And they just went. It wasn't just faith, it wasn't just believing, it was actually action at this point. It makes me think of an example or the teaching of this concept that Boyd K. Packer gave years ago. Of course, I'm paraphrasing, I'm not quoting him. But he says that faith is like standing in the dark. And just a little bit ahead of you, the path is illuminated. And faith is when we take that step into the darkness. And when that foot hits the ground illuminates a little bit around us. And then if we want to move forward again, obtaining more light or understanding, we need to take another step into the seemingly darkness, in which the Lord will then illuminate the path ahead of us just a little bit more. We see this example playing out in this story. So we get Joseph. It's February 3rd. February 4th. Look at your revelation. The first one we're going to talk about is section 41. On February 4th, 3 days later, this revelation is given. Now, I find that to be significant because of the experience I just told you about Joseph like taking a step into the darkness. He acted on his faith. He now gets to Ohio, and it's essentially, okay, Lord, I fulfilled your commandment. I'm here in Ohio. What do you want me to do next? There was no blueprint of Joseph, you're going to go to Ohio, and this is going to happen, this is going to happen, this is going to happen, etc., etc. The whole thing wasn't presented to Joseph. Line upon line, precept upon precept. Here a little, there a little, is the lesson that Joseph did learn, and all of us should be learning. Joseph gets here. He says, okay, Lord, what do you want me to do now? And then the revelations start to come. Sections 41, 42, 43, and 44 are all given within the month of February. So they're all coming fast, on average, one a week, telling Joseph exactly what to do. Now, the second lesson that I'd like to point out from this whole experience is Joseph pulls up into Kirtland. There's 127 baptized members of the church, and there's dozens, if not a couple hundred more, who are on the verge of being baptized, who know of Joseph. So those who are baptized, they certainly have a testimony that Joseph is a prophet. Never heard him speak, never seen him, and they have a testimony of the Book of Mormon, and he's the one who translated it. So there could have been, if Joseph was of worldly pursuits. In this situation, it would have been the thing to do for Joseph to say, hey, Sydney, you know everybody, get them all together, tell them I'm here, and you're going to introduce me. I'm going to come out to a parade and fanfare. But he didn't do that. He instead went straight to Newell Kay and Elizabeth Ann Whitney, who had prayed in faith that they could know the truth. And so the Lord sent Joseph to the one, in this case to the two. But the Lord knew of the Whitney's desire to know the truth. He knew of the one, which is a concept that the Lord continues to try to teach us, not only in the Doctrine and Covenants, but also in the Book of Mormon. And that's the way the Lord works, is one by one with the individuals. Okay, let's get into the sections. Section 41, not very long, but section 41, this section focuses on Edward Partridge being called as bishop. And there's a couple of things I'd like to point out that go along with that history. So Joseph needs to start organizing. He's got a lot of members of the church. He's got a lot coming in from New York. The missionaries are out there. They're seeing a lot of success. We're having this gathering. We need to get ourselves organized so we can take care of these people spiritually, and like in verse 42, temporally as well. Section 42, I'm going to show you how they take care of them temporally as well. And so we've got to get organized. We need a bishop. And so in section 41, Edward Partridge is called as a bishop. But it's interesting here, before he's called as a bishop, which is in verse 9, the Lord starts out in verse 3. And I love how the Lord gives the blessing before the commandment, which is often the case. And he says, it's almost like he's going to drop the hammer and say, hey, this is what I want you to do. But before he does that, he says, look, I'm in charge. I'm going to bless you. I'm going to take care of you if you're faithful. Now be faithful by doing this. And that's what he does here in verse 3. And by the prayer of your faith, you shall receive my law, that you may know how to govern my church and have all things right before me. So if you have faith first, then I'm going to show you what to do. That must have been quite comforting to Edward when in verse 9 he's called to be a bishop. Hopefully he quickly recalled verse 3. Verse 9, when he's called to be a bishop, he's not told how to do it. There's no such thing as a general church handbook of instruction. There's no former bishop that he can go to and say, hey, how did you do it? What did you do? How did you get started? In these circumstances, what do I do? He didn't have any of that. He had to rely on, in verse 3, his faith and seek out the guidance of the Lord, which he would do. But as the Lord promised, I'm going to be there for you, section 42 would then become essentially the handbook for Edward Partridge to teach him how to do this new calling. And let me show you a few of those things. So we go to section 42, and section 42 would become known by the early members of the church as the laws of the church. As you read through this section, and it's lengthy, it's long, whatever it is, 70 or whatever verses, but it's long and it contains so much, 93 verses. It's a long section. But as you read through there, it's just kind of organization. This is what we do, this is how we do it, this is kind of why we do it. Not too much why we do it, but more of this is what we do and this is how we do it. Teaching Bishop Partridge, kind of his responsibility, and all of us as members of the church as well. There are a couple of things I want to point out. Without doing the doctrinal study for you, I do want to take you to verses 30 through 39, because there is some historical context with these verses that are really important to understand. Now, before the missionaries showed up in the Kirtland area, before the restored gospel message was brought to these people who were being prepared by the Lord, as I taught from section 35, they were desiring to have a church setting as closely resembled to the New Testament church as possible. They recognized that there wasn't a church that was the New Testament church. They were trying to get as close as they could to it. And section 42, those verses that I outlined, 30 through 39, addresses something that they were attempting to do to be like the ancient saints. And it's assumed that they got this idea from Acts chapter 4, verse 32, where they were trying to live a type of law of consecration. Acts 4:32 says that the saints were of one heart and of one soul. Neither said any of them that aught of these things which I possessed was his own, but they had all things in common. They were trying to live that law. Very difficult, and it wasn't successful. It caused a lot of division and a lot of quarreling among these people, and now who are now members of the church. And when they were trying to live with all things in common, they called themselves the family. And the idea behind the family, and mind you, got to remember, this was happening before the missionaries showed up. Okay, and the idea is that as the family would share everything. Nothing belongs to anyone. Everything belongs to the family. And so if you needed a tool, you go get it. If you needed food, you go into the neighbor's house and you take it. You don't take it, but you have access to it. There's one story of an individual who came up to another and said, "Hey, can I borrow your watch?" And he says, "Sure." And he takes his watch and he goes and sells the watch. And then the original watch owner comes and says, "Hey, can I have my watch back?" And he said, "Oh, I sold your watch for cash and I already spent the cash." And the original watch owner says, "What are you talking about? What did you do that for?" And the guy who borrowed the watch said, "Oh, I thought it was all in the family. I thought it was as much mine as it was yours." And so there were problems. It wasn't working out. One thing that we've come to understand as Latter-day Saints, the church has been organized for 190 years, is we have figured out, we've experienced that the programs of the church, which are revealed by the Lord, are perfect. Now, the people working in those organizations and programs aren't. Okay, I understand that. But the programs, the way they're designed to work perfectly. So as these people, these citizens because they're not members of the church yet, as these citizens of Kirtland were attempting to live this law of consecration as they understood it from the New Testament, it wasn't administered to them perfectly, and so it didn't work out perfectly. So in section 42, verses 30 through 39, one of the first things that this newly called bishop needs to do, Bishop Partridge, is sort this mess out. Of this, Joseph said that members of the family, that, quote, they were striving to do the will of God so far as they knew it. Joseph says, yeah, there's problems. We got to fix this. But you know what? They're doing the best they can. And that's okay. Let's not get after them and get upset and get crazy and tell them they're wrong. They're doing the best they can. Now, what they are doing is not in complete accordance with the Lord, So let's correct it. Let's make some correction here, which they did. So let me take you just through a couple of little highlights of 30 through 39, where the Lord explains the error. I was going to say error, but how the Lord's going to explain how to do it better, how to do this law of consecration better. So in verse 33, and inasmuch as ye impart of your substance unto the poor, you will do it unto me. That sounds like the stuff King Benjamin would teach, right? And then it goes through and it says that the bishop is going to be in charge of overseeing this. Who are the poor? Give of your substance, your excess. The bishop's going to hold it, and then he'll seek out the needy, or the needy will seek out him, and he'll disperse what the needy need. Now, they call it law of consecration. Today, that program matches more up in line with fast offerings. You give of your excess to the bishop. He, in consultation with the Relief Society president, disperses those funds, or in some cases, those goods, or even services, to those individuals who stand in need. We're doing it in the church today. Let's jump down into verse 33, talking again about the bishop. And the bishop, it shall be kept to administer to those who have not. So he's the point man. He's in charge here. Instead of the way the family was doing it, where, hey, I have a need, so I'm going to go to your kitchen table and take what I need. He says, okay, we're going to do this in order. We're going to do it the right way. We're going to appoint the bishop. The bishop is going to receive graciously the things that are given without obligation. Okay, the law of consecration, as you read it here in Doctrine and Covenants 42 and elsewhere throughout the Revelations, it wasn't compulsory. So as people would freely give, then the bishop, the agent, would then administer to those that stood in need. In verse 34, therefore the residue shall be kept in my storehouse. So the excess, he's going to keep it in the storehouse. Remember that list of all the firsts that took place in Kirtland? One of them was the first bishop's storehouse. Yeah, because some of your excess wasn't cash. Nobody had cash back then. It was my excess eggs and chicken and bucket of barley and whatever else they had. And so we're going to keep it in a storehouse, and the bishop will administer to the poor and the needy, etc. And that's verse 34. And then let's jump all the way down to verse 38. For inasmuch as you do it unto the least of these, you do it unto me. And that's coming at the end of the Lord saying, hey, if you've got excess, share. Be kind. Be generous. If you want a watch, don't take a watch. That's not the Lord's way. The Lord's way is first and foremost to have the individual feel a desire to love God and love his neighbor by imparting of his excess. And then the agent, the bishop, will be in charge to keep things cool and calm and right by providing to those who do stand in need. So sometimes I hear, I shouldn't say sometimes because it's not like it's frequent, but I have heard in Sunday school and in classes and in other places where people will say, boy, it sure is going to be hard when we're asked to live the law of consecration. I'm mistaken, perhaps. Certainly wouldn't be the first time, but I don't know of a revelation that says a law of consecration is coming. That someday that we're going to turn over our chickens and our barley and whatever else. Now, we have been asked to give freely in our fast offerings and other donations. And so when those comments are made, it's going to be hard when we're asked to live the law of consecration. I think there's a couple of things that we're forgetting. President Hinckley says, quote, the law of sacrifice and the law of consecration have not been done away with and are still in effect. Now, in the temple, we're taught the definition of the law of consecration, and it has nothing to do with property or money or chickens or barley or whatever else these saints were sharing with each other. And so if you've attended the temple, or if you're preparing to attend the temple, in either case, the definition of the law of consecration, which President Hinckley says is still in effect, is given, and there's no time stamp on it. There's no someday you're going to be doing this. It's you can do it, and you can do it today, and you really should do it today because you love God and you love your neighbor. Now, in section 42, there's some other questions. So poor Bishop Partridge has to approach these few hundreds of people and say, hey, you're doing your best, but let's scratch everything you've been doing and let's start over. And according to verse 33, through 39. Let's do it the Lord's way. And when we did it the Lord's way, it was awesome. And it was great. And it provided a way for when the saints from the East came into Ohio with nothing but the clothes on their back, to where people could consecrate their surplus and say, yeah, I've got a place on my property where you can pitch a tent and even build a log cabin. And yeah, you like my big farm? Well, come and work in my farm and you can take home the potatoes and different things. And so they were taught the concept and they lived the concept, and they and those who were recipients of this concept all were blessed. And that's what I mean by the programs of the church are perfect. The people working in the programs, no, none of us are perfect, but the program, the way that it's supposed to work, as outlined in 30 through 39, it is perfect. It works, and it did in the ancient church, or not the ancient church, the early days of the church. And you'll recall President Nelson's recent comments in a general conference address where he was talking about fast offerings and how in 2020 fast offering donations went crazy. They went through the roof, and they were able to disperse not only food but supplies and needs, support the temporal needs of millions of people throughout the world. So we have this small community in Kirtland, and we're doing the same thing today. And all of us are invited to participate. And it's a great thing. Now, some other questions that were asked and that are revealed in section, or answered through Revelation in section 42, are questions like, should we gather all in one place, or should we gather in multiple places? Because now Joseph's been called here. The New York Saints have been called here. Lord, what's this gathering supposed to look like? The answer is in there. You'll find it. The other question that you'll look for and answer is, should the church, essentially, should we live by rigid, strict rules and laws, or should we just be kind of free and easy? See, churches in the 1800s were one or the other, where it was either kind of like a law of Moses, where you must do this and this and this, and if you don't, you'll be damned for all of eternity. And then there was the other the other religion mentality of, you know what? It doesn't really matter if you go to church, as long as you feel a closeness to God, and you might feel that in the mountains or out working in your garden, where you can feel the Spirit. But they were saying, that's fine. Skip church, go on a walk, or go fishing, and you'll feel the Spirit, and that's good enough. That's sufficient. And so Joseph's question was, hey, we're getting big, we're getting organized. What side of this line are we supposed to be on? The answer is found in section 42. But to kind of give you, what do they say, to spoil the end or whatever, spoiler alert. The spoiler alert is the Lord says, get in the middle. Kind of get in the middle, because you're going to be directed as to what to do by the Spirit. And we're going to have preachers. They're going to be ordained. They're going to have authority. And they're going to go out and preach as moved upon by the Spirit. So we've got organization, but we rely heavily upon the Spirit. So we kind of hit that middle ground. But the Lord gets more detailed there in section 42, which you can research out and discover. So that leads us to 43. So 42 is very lengthy. It's the law of the church. It's nicknamed by the early saints and by the prophet himself. And there's a lot in there. Okay, we've got to do all these things. All right, let's roll up our sleeves and get to work. Okay, Joseph, how? How do we do these things? Joseph says, I don't know. Let's get 7 elders together, you 7 and me. Let's sit down and let's figure out how we're going to do everything that is found in this Revelation, section 42. And as they're having this conversation, how do we do it? How do we do section 42? Section 43 is given. And as you go through it, and the Come Follow Me manual, lesson from the manual walks you through these concepts and ideas of, okay, here's what the Lord is teaching, here's how we're going to start implementing. Now, as a little bonus historical story, as you'll also read in here, there was a woman who was a member of the church, and she came forward and she said that she was receiving revelation on behalf of the church. Now, you'll remember from a previous Beyond Come Follow Me, we talked about this very same thing with Hiram Page. Hiram Page claimed to be doing the same thing. And so also in section 43, the Lord reiterates the same things that he taught in regards to the Hiram Page incident as is going on with the incident with this lady who came forward with the same idea. So he's reiterating that we've got a prophet who receives revelation on behalf of the church. And so that doctrine is taught again. That woman, by the way, it doesn't matter if it was a woman or man, but it just happened to be a woman. She got offended, and she ended up leaving the church because her revelations weren't accepted as revelation for the church. An important concept. There's a difference between revelation for the church and personal revelation. That woman, as well as any member of the church, can receive personal revelation, and even people who aren't members of the church. But with the constant companionship of the Holy Ghost, we are entitled to continual, constant, frequent personal revelation. And that revelation should come. And you know what? That made me think of something else. Let me kind of go off script here. I don't really have a script. But if you look back in section 41, I'm not saying the two are connected. This woman's experience in section 43. But the idea of personal revelation and it being personal, you could tie it to section 41, verse 6. For it is not meet that the things which belong to the children of the kingdom should be given to them that are not worthy, or to dogs, or the pearls be cast before swine. In other words, things that are personal, things that are sacred, keep them. Keep them personal and keep them sacred to you. And so if this woman had been receiving personal revelation, I wouldn't doubt that. But to share it, and to say that this revelation, although applicable to me, must be applicable to all, that's where the error came in. And that's where we can come back and learn from 44 verse 6. Personal revelation is personal, it's yours. And if you share it with others, it might be different. It might be a little off from another personal revelation, and that's okay. You know, the handbook, the current handbook, is full of that. Where it's, you pull up a topic in the handbook and it says, well, on this topic, an individual, and oftentimes a married couple, should approach the Lord and receive revelation for what's best for them in this particular case. And there's probably a dozen of those situations in the handbook where the Lord says, hey, on this topic, pray and find your own revelation. And what you get might be something that somebody else gets. And so it's personal, let's keep it to yourself. And share it when prompted, I suppose, with others. That's a little side shoot there. Something on my that came to my mind. Okay, so that takes us. We went through section 43. Let's go to section 44. Now, there's not too much historical context behind section 44. The Lord just instructs Joseph, and Sydney happens to be there as well, and he says, hey, get the elders of the church together. We're going to have a conference. Now, the elders of the church gathered frequently for conferences. Now, this isn't a general conference. A conference, perhaps in this definition, is just a gathering. It would be more like a council, what we'd call today. Get the elders together and let's hold a council. Let's hold a meeting where they can be instructed, uplifted, edified. And so which gathering was this referring to? I'm not quite sure. I don't know. And it might be open-ended to, hey, gather together in council, and maybe it's not a specific event. Maybe the Lord was opening this door and saying, hey, gather them together and let's learn and grow together. And as you read verses 1, 2, and 3 on that, the Lord gives some ideas as to what this council or this conference should entail. I do have a story. I want to conclude with it, though, so I'm going to come back to verses 1 through 3 to tell my story. But let me share, before I end there, with verses 4 through 6. Now, this, from here on out, is it's not an interpretation, because this could be interpreted a million different ways. Just like I referred to with personal revelation, I read this morning, and I thought of a current event, and I put the two together. Now, when I read this a year from now, I'm going to think of it in a completely different way. If I had read this a year or two ago, there's no way I would have made the connection that I'm about to make now. And so I don't say it's my interpretation, because it could be interpreted in millions of different ways. But here's some hope that I found in these verses that's pertinent to what we as members of the church are going through today. Verse 4, and many shall be converted, insomuch that ye shall obtain power to organize yourselves according to the laws of man. Now, we did that April 6, 1830. We're going to continue doing it by organizing entities known as wards, branches, and stakes. So, yeah, is that what the Lord's talking about specifically? Yes. But how do we apply this to our own lives? How do we liken this to ourselves? Here's how I likened it today for myself. First, you got to be converted. And those who are converted, not just baptized, but converted to the gospel of Jesus Christ, which is different, they shall have power to organize within the laws of man. So we've got this COVID thing going on. And I'm not going to get political as far as what politicians and governments have imposed. And what they've imposed in my city and state is going to be different than what they've imposed in your state or in your country, as I know that we have viewers from every continent tuning in. And so throughout the world, it's different, I know. But those who have been converted, meaning those who are really striving to do their very best to come closer to the Savior, they've been given power to organize despite the restrictions and the freedom revoking things that have been going on from governments. And the Lord set it up perfectly. Here's your Come Follow Me manual. You're going to have a home-based gospel learning experience for a time. And we've experienced that. And we've been given power to organize ourselves. How do we have the sacrament meeting? Well, first we need to make sure that we've got the power and the authority to administer the sacrament in our homes. And if we don't, we're going to organize ourselves to the extent where we have ministering brethren who can come into the home and take care of those things for us. So despite what the world governments do, the Lord is going to provide a way through His power to allow us to organize and to come closer to Him and continue to be converted every day as we strive our best. Number 5, that your enemies, and I'm not saying that the government's the enemy. I'm not giving any political opinion here, so don't pretend I am. That your enemies may not have power over you, that you may be preserved in all things. Can you imagine what would happen? Do imagine this. If you've ever been on a ward council, or a counselor to someone who's on that council, or a spouse, or a sibling, anyone, and if you haven't, you can at least understand what that council does. That ward council gets together, and among all the other things that they do, one of the things they do is they say, who have we noticed that hasn't been at church? And I tell you what, when an active family has been absent from the church, their church meetings, for 2 or 3 weeks, the ward council takes notice. And when those 2 or 3 weeks turn into 4 or 5 or 6 weeks, we start panicking and reaching out and saying, hey, we notice that you're not here. We miss you. We love you. We want you to continue enjoying the gospel of Jesus Christ, the blessings that come with it. How can we help? So on this topic of how I'm likening it with this COVID restrictions, the Lord says in verse 5, He promises that we will be preserved in all things. So now after 3 or 4 weeks, the council takes notice. After 5 or 6 weeks, they start to take action. Well, in some parts of the world, we've gone without church meetings for over a year. I live in America, and in my particular area that I live, we haven't done a regular in-person, the whole ward together church meeting since March 2020. It's been 13 months. And we went like 10 or 11 or whatever months before the first semi kind of in-person sacrament meeting. And yet when I go to the church and when I talk to my friends that are members of the ward, I find that the vast majority are still active members of the church. And they're going back to church when it's permissible and when they're comfortable to do so. And so when we see pre-COVID, where you only go a few weeks and you've lost the spirit and it's going to be a hard road back, we're now 12, 13, 14, and it's going to be more months. And yet the promise of the Lord given to the saints in 1831 is we'll be preserved. We'll be preserved as long as what? We're converted. We access power through personal revelation. I'm back in verse 4. We've organized ourselves, and by doing so, we are being preserved. And in verse 6, just in case we can't do it on our own, which none of us can, behold, I say unto you that you must visit the poor and the needy and administer to their relief. The ministering program of the church. And I told you a long time ago, a few minutes ago, that every program of the church is perfect because it's God's program and He's perfect. And so we look at the experience that all of us are going through to one degree or another throughout the world. And that's why I say, without interpreting section 4, I find great hope in section 44 as I've likened it to myself. And I told you I'd go backwards and go back to this calling of a conference among the elders. Section 44, verses 1 through 3. I won't read them to you. I won't dive into it because you can do that and you'll do a great job doing it. But I will tell you a story about a time in Kirtland when Joseph did gather the elders of the church. At the Isaac Morley farm, before the saints arrived, Isaac Morley and his wife decided they wanted to educate their children and the neighboring children and the children in the neighborhood. And so they built a schoolhouse up on a hill behind the farm. And this farmhouse was, according to Wilford Woodruff, 14 foot square. Pretty small, kind of a typical size of a bedroom, right? And a bigger bedroom, but 14 foot square log home, and that's where they would have their school lessons. When Joseph arrived into the Kirtland area, Isaac Morley said, you know what, we're going to move the schooling somewhere else. This Joseph can be the worldwide headquarters of the church. You can have your office here and you can have your meetings here. And so he did just that. As instructed in section 44, he gathered every single holder of the priesthood into this little 14 by 14 room. Anybody who held the priesthood was in that room this night. And Joseph gave some instruction, and he asked for a testimony meeting. But in that testimony meeting, he asked the brethren to specifically share their testimony about the destiny of the church, the growth of the church. And so they went around the room, and one elder after the other seemed to kind of outdo the previous one, in that it started out with Joseph. I think that with our missionary efforts, we're going to have members of the church beyond Kirtland. We're going to be in the neighboring cities and towns. And somebody else would say, I think we'll be throughout all of Ohio. And the next one, I think we'll be into the neighboring states. And it just kind of got bigger and bigger. And I think it was Brigham that was the boldest of them all and said, Joseph, I think we're going to have branches of the church throughout the United States. Well, it finally gets back to Joseph, and he hadn't said anything at this point until he says this. And this is a quote. He says, Brethren, I have been very much edified by your testimonies tonight. But you know no more about the future destiny of this church than a babe upon its mother's lap. This church will fill North and South America. Yea, it will fill the world. That must have blown their minds. Not comprehensible. The world? We've heard of England, and we think there's something out there called Asia. The world, Joseph says. Today, in 2021, are we not witnessing the fulfillment of that prophecy? Yes, for decades we have had physical missionaries in every corner of the world, essentially. speaking dozens of languages. The Book of Mormon being translated, at least in part, in well over 100 languages. A General Conference being translated into 93 languages live. More languages coming after the conclusion of General Conference. We've witnessed in 2020 and into 2021 that the fulfillment of this prophecy going to every corner of the world is literally true, in that we've gone less in person and more virtual. And that virtual has carried the gospel message as far as an internet connection can be made, which is much further, well beyond the bounds of where physical missionaries and leaders of the church once could have gone. We hear of the temple announcement in Russia. We hear of the temple announcement in Shanghai. We hear of the announcement of 20 temples just in this last conference, and the calling of tens of thousands of missionaries that are moving forward despite whatever the world has given us in 2020 and in 2021. The work of the Lord continues to move today. We read several times in the earlier sections, and will continue to read in the later sections of the Doctrine and Covenants, behold, a marvelous work is about to come forth among the children of men. That marvelous work is continuing today. We started with Palmyra, Manchester, Harmony, and Fayette, and all the things that were restored and revealed in those places. We now get to Kirtland, and Kirtland is going to be the springboard to take us to the world as we go through all these revelations, and the Lord continues to reveal line upon line, precept upon precept. It's exciting, and I'm excited to tell you the stories of Kirtland as they unfold over the next several weeks and months as we continue to meet together. So enjoy your doctrinal study of sections 41 through 44. In the video description below this video that you're seeing is a link. You're going to like it. It's a video that's less than 5 minutes long. It's starring Steve Young. And Steve tells a story about Kirtland, Ohio. You can't miss it. So click that link and watch that 4.5 minute video. It's very entertaining, very inspiring, and you see the hand of the Lord in these latter days. And I say all of this in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.